Recording. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Friends of the Cabildo member lecture series. I have another person who popped in. So I hope if you're in New Orleans, you're dry right now because we've had a soggy day. But thank you so much for joining tonight. And I hope that you've been enjoying these lectures in 2021, and I hope you continue to attend them. Everybody's coming in at the last minute. So tonight's speaker is Dr. Alex McManus. Alex has a PhD from Tulane University, and as we were talking about beforehand, the only two things that people get more riled up about are Huey Long and yellow fever. And so tonight we're going to talk about one of those two. And so we're going to be talking about Huey Long tonight. So with that, just a couple housekeeping things. If you do have questions, please use the chat function, and we will ask them at the end. We'll leave a couple minutes at the end for Alex to get to ask some questions. And please keep your Zoom on mute. And tomorrow morning, even if you attended tonight, I will be emailing you out a recording so you can have 30 days afterwards. You can watch it. So always remember, if you do want to sign up for any of our lectures, but you can't attend, we send them to you the next day. So with that, I'm going to let Alex talk about Huey Long. And thank you so much, Alex, for speaking for us tonight.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thanks for having me. Thank you to the Friends of the Cabildo for putting this on. Today, the talk, I've titled it, He Was a Hitler-like Dictator. What did Huey Long's enemies mean when they called him a fascist? Just want to, before getting into the talk proper, mention a couple of Huey Long's enemies that were New Orleans or Louisiana based. The first is the Carters. Harding Carter, during the Long period, he owned and ran a newspaper in Hammond, Louisiana, which was his hometown. In 1939, after the Long period, the Huey Long period, he moved to Greenville, Mississippi in the Yazoo Delta. Launched the successful Delta Democrat Times there, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1946 for a series of editorials, and the paper distinguished itself during the Civil Rights era. His wife, Betty Werline Carter, of a well-known New Orleans family, a graduate of Newcomb College, partner in her husband's endeavors in the newspaper business, and she also did a star turn in Ken Burns' documentary about Huey Long. They both, I think, despised Huey Long with a passion, and just to give you a sense of that dislike, later in life, Betty Carter, in an interview, said, quoting, "We used to try to think of ways to kill him. He would come and speak in the bandstand in the park, and his listeners would sit on folding chairs. I thought we should take a sharp nail with the point made even sharper and dip it in tetanus and stick it up in one of those chairs where he'd sit on it. He wouldn't know it, and he'd die the death he deserved, the death of a mad dog." So they didn't like him. And they were prominent anti-Longs at the time, although young. Also, another famous enemy of Huey Long was Hilda Phelps Hammond, again, a graduate of Newcomb College from a front-rank New Orleans family. She was the driving force in the Louisiana Women's Committee, which fought for years to get the US Senate to investigate charges of corruption and election fraud relating to Long. And then also Cecil Morgan, who lived a long life. During the Long period, he was elected to the state legislature in 1928. He represented Shreveport, Caddo Parish. He was a house manager during the impeachment of Huey Long, a man of indisputable charm and straightforward character, Morgan's importance as an anti-Long was multiplied by his long life into the internet age and his willingness to be interviewed into the 1990s about the Long period. Cecil, also from a front rank Louisiana family, the old state capitol had been built on the site of his family's ancestral home. His ancestors include Richard Howell, who was a captain in the Revolutionary Army, Sarah Morgan, the Civil War diarist, Mary Chestnut and Jefferson Davis were collateral ancestors. David Morgan, an ancestor, moved to Louisiana after the purchase and participated in the 1812 convention that prepared a constitution for Louisiana. He also, David Morgan, commanded the American forces on the west bank of the Mississippi during in the Battle of New Orleans. Cecil, to quote one scholar, hated Huey Long till the day that he died, absolutely despised him. So I just wanted to establish some of the characters on the anti-Long side. For those, I think this audience will know a little bit about Huey, but just a very, very brief recap. Long was a populist politician from the North Louisiana backwoods, elected governor in 28, a US senator in 1930, dominated state politics until his death in 1935, put through a legislative program, including free school books, the provision of natural gas to New Orleans, a road and bridge building infrastructure program funded by bonds. He increased taxation on raw material extraction and refining. He built a new state capitol and a governor's mansion. Nationally, he announced his Share the Wealth program in 1934, a manifesto proposing to solve the Great Depression with a crude redistribution of wealth that was popular with have-nots, and seemed to position Long as the main threat to the re-election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1936. And Long was controversial, not only in the ends that he pursued, but especially in the means that he employed, the ruthless means he employed. And it's also worth mentioning that Long was a byword for political drama, for political excitement. He was a superb political showman, extremely intelligent, and really the neon light in the political street. You couldn't take your eyes off of him. Okay. So the talk then, Huey, he was a Hitler-like dictator. Well, when faced with an enemy that one especially reviles, it's normal to reach for the most denigrating comparisons the imagination can supply. And the anti-Longs were no exception to this rule. Sometimes these comparisons could be far-fetched, even exotic. There's one in the New Times-Picayune editorial, which referred to a Tibetan 8th century monarch who, quoting the Times-Picayune, ordained that all men should share equally in the wealth of the country. An equal division was made, but the equality soon disappeared. Yet twice again, all were made to share and share alike. But the inequalities were worse than before, for it was found that the poor, who had become indolent during their time of ease, became poorer than ever. After the third attempt, the king was poisoned by his mother, end quote. Times-Picayune did not like Huey Long. Within the Western context, the Middle Ages provided a frame of reference. Long rules over Louisiana, said one editorial, as if it were a vassal state in medieval times. There were other comparisons too. Julius Caesar was one that Robert Penn Warren, the author of All the King's Men, quite liked. There were a lot of comparisons to animals, usually not flattering. Long was compared unfavorably to a snake, frequently called a pig. And here is one calling him a rat, and in the form of a lynched effigy. Well, two of the more interesting and important comparisons that were used were to the hard left and to the hard right, to socialism / communism / Marxism, and to fascism. So I'll propose to deal with socialism quickly first. The headline of a Shreveport newspaper likened Long's views to Marxism as early as 1927, before he was even elected governor, saying, "Louisiana must not let Bolshevism in," it stated. Speaking to US Senate subcommittee in 1934, the wife of former Governor Ruffin Pleasant said Long was using the Senate as a sounding board for his Bolshevik utterances. Pleasant himself said during a radio speech, "At heart, Long is an ultra-socialist. His real views go beyond Karl Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky." Pleasant sounded a dire warning. "The danger is oft times just around the corner, and your children of the future are about to cross the perilous track on the omnibus of time." Pleasant backed up this forward position by saying that following the Soviet example, Long intended to banish religion. For much of Louisiana, Soviet communism would have been what they would have been thinking about when the word socialist was used. And they probably would have been, perhaps this was all they were aware about of socialism, was the Soviet Union's hostility to religion. But although Long could be disdainful of God's intermediaries on earth, he used scripture to justify and explain his political positions. One example, this is a report from the New York Times, shows how well Huey was protected himself from the charge of being a socialist. I'm quoting from the New York Times here. Senator Long, who occasioned many bursts of laughter from the audience, began by saying that under socialism, a man would not even own his own garters. "They'll belong to the government," he declared. And he went on to say that this would be very bad because it would destroy the profit motive. Apologizing for his sketchy knowledge of history, Senator Long traced the system of capitalism back to God. The husbandry of Cain and the flocks and land of Abraham represented capitalism in its first forms, direct from the inspiration of the Creator, he argued. Getting at last to the American scene, he declared that the trouble was not with capitalism, but the accumulation of property and power in the hands of the few. Well, you can see it's very hard to get a socialist label to stick to this. Long had somehow managed the feat of framing a left of center program, which Share the Wealth was. It was a left of center program. He had framed it in such completely American terms that it was proofed against the socialist charge. 40 years later, in the middle of the Cold War, when the charge of socialist was even easier to make and even more damaging to receive, John Wayne, in a notorious interview with Playboy magazine, saw a communist in everyone, but still not in Huey Long. And this is quoting John Wayne. "So I went to Dmitrik and said, 'Hey, are you a commie?' He said, 'No, I'm not a commie. My father was a Russian. I was born in Canada. But if the masses of the American people want communism, I think it'd be good for our country.' When he used the word masses, he exposed himself. That word is not a part of Western terminology, so I knew he was a commie. Well, it later came out that he was. I also knew two other fellows who really did things that were detrimental to our way of life. One of them was Carl Foreman, the guy who wrote the screenplay for High Noon, and the other was Robert Rosen, the one who made the picture about Huey Long, All the King's Men. In Rosen's version of All the King's Men, which he sent me to read for a part, every character who had any responsibility at all was guilty of some offense against society. To make Huey Long a wonderful rough pirate was great, but according to this picture, everybody was a shit, except for this weakling intern doctor who was trying to find a place in the world. I sent the script back to Charlie Feldman, my agent, and said, 'If you ever send me a script like this again, I'll fire you.' Ironically, it won the Academy Award." End quote. Well, if you couldn't even get John Wayne to think you were a communist, then you're pretty well proofed from the charge. And the charge of socialism just didn't stick to Huey Long, although it's been a popular way of trying to brand people who are left of center and to try to diminish their popularity, socialism being something of a bogey word, even if you go back to the 1930s. Well, in any case, during the Long years, there was a much more fashionable comparison to make, and this was to fascism. And it was much more successful. Fascism was an interwar phenomenon, shiny and new, And most Americans, the educated and the ignorant alike, didn't really know what it was, but thought that they did. Franklin Roosevelt, for example, compared Long to Hitler and his haranguing method, his arousing of hate, envy, fear, and all animal passions. FDR's lieutenant, James Farley, was reminded of Huey Long when he met Mussolini in Rome in 1933. In 1935, General Hugh Johnson, FDR supporter, denounced Long in a radio speech in which he stated that Hitler couldn't hold a candle to Huey in the art of the old Barnum ballyhoo, and that Huey is the Hitler of one of our sovereign states. In racially organized Jim Crow, Louisiana, accusing an ostensibly white person of having a racially mixed ancestry, a touch of the tar brush in the idiom of the time, was a popular form of slander. Roosevelt's proxies, amongst others, helped to stain Long with a touch of the fascist brush. Early reaction to Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men was marked by negative comment about its somewhat sympathetic portrayal of Huey Long. The literary critic Robert Gorham Davis, who incidentally introduced the young Norman Mailer to creative writing, so he has a lot to answer for, wrote a famous New York Times review of the novel, saying, "Its total effect is to justify Long and the intellectuals who played ball with him, to romanticize him, to have a kind of love affair with him through the three women who adore him. I am so sick of this," wrote Penn Warren to a friend, referring to his sense of becoming America's chief crypto-fascist. The New York Times, in its obituary of Long, stated that, quote, "In reality, Senator Long set up a fascist government in Louisiana. It was disguised, but only thinly." In 1935, the journalist Raymond Graham Swing, who later took a courageous stand against McCarthyism, considered Long a forerunner of American fascism, especially in Long's domination of the three branches of state government, and most especially in Long's charismatic popularity, that is, in the emotional connection between Long and his supporters in a time of economic despair, a time of frustration with traditional politicians. Swing, however, also raised some of the difficulties that characterizing Long as even proto-fascist posed, difficulties that later academics returned to. Just to quote a little bit from Swing, however, the parallel must not be drawn too closely. Huey is a vulgar American politician who has learned to play the two-fisted, sordid game of vote-getting and patronage infinitely better than his opponents. At his worst, he is no more unprincipled than they, his sin being that he is more ruthless and successful. Huey's autobiography is a scratchy, smug little tale of his political victories, tossed off in 2 weeks. Even so, Huey is an improvement on Hitler in two respects worthy of mention. He is free of the virus of racial prejudice, and as his educational dreams show, he is not anti-intellectual. That is not to say that he does not have the proverbial Southerner's disdain of the colored man, but it is not the basis of his political creed. Indeed, he prides himself on having improved Negro education in Louisiana and on the exemption of virtually all Negroes in the state from taxation. Nor will Huey Long ever burn the books of his contemporaries in a public bonfire. Like many a man deprived of an academic education, he has an almost touching faith in it. End quote. Well, Swing's put his finger on something important, namely that Long didn't mix his economic populism with a cultural, racist, or nationalistic anti-intellectual populism. Long would have needed to sail in those kinds of populist waters to even flirt with the academic standard of fascist. And he really had no interest in those sorts of things. And he also disliked violence personally and in the political sphere. T. Harry Williams, who literally wrote the book on Long, the big biography that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1970, T. Harry Williams rejected the fascist comparison, and he was puzzled by its longevity. Quoting Williams, "It is not so understandable that the fascist label has stuck to him and become the enduring verdict on him." He wrote, continuing, "Curiously, its accuracy has hardly been questioned. William's rejection of the fascist comparison has been accepted by all serious Long scholars. William Ivy Hare, who wrote the next biographer of Long, wrote, yet the fascist label does not stick to Long. Alan Brinkley, another famous historian, wrote, Long was not fascist in any meaningful sense of the term. And Brinkley continued that Long's relationship with his voters was transactional and typically American, that it wasn't a mystical civil religion, as fascism is sometimes considered. Long and his supporters fundamentally delighted in his showy display and exercise of backwoods shrewdness, and the metaphysics of the thing were not much more than a prolonged middle-fingered salute to the establishment. However, outside the narrow world of Long specialists, nothing has changed. The doyen of American literary critics, or at least he was before he died recently, Harold Bloom, for example, in a 1987 piece about All the King's Men, wrote that Long was, quote, the most persuasive of our country's native fascists, our Franco and Mussolini, as it were, end quote. Well, fascism required an enemy in our midst. Quite specifically, it was communists in both Italy and Germany. And in the case of Germany, also Jews. Long didn't target communism. He targeted Standard Oil in Louisiana. He targeted nationally, he targeted big finance. He targeted entrenched interests. He also seemed fairly disinterested in the issue of race. Yet blacks would have been an obvious candidate for the enemy in our midst in Long's world. Similarly, Long made not one anti-Semitic remark that made it into the historical record. The race question regarding Long is quite a big one and a talk in its own right. But the anti-Semitism question is smaller, a little less traveled as well, so I can say something about it. The anti-Long and Jewish New Orleans journalist Herman Deutsch, one of the top 2 or 3 Louisiana journalists of the time, wrote that it is absolutely right that Huey was never actuated by religious intolerance or bigotry. This is all the more noteworthy since anti-Semitism was frequently present in varying degrees in the beliefs and rhetoric of the more ornery populist backwoods tradition that Long came out of. The small cotton farmer, the sharecropper were often in hock to the sometimes Jewish small-town merchant. Long's Wynn Parish mentor, S.J. Harper, was mesmerized, for example, by the Protocols of Zion, while his Farmerville ally Harvey Fields, or famously his acolyte Gerald L.K. Smith, had considerable anti-Semitic prejudice to set beside their many other prejudices. But if Long had absorbed anti-Semitism in the home or through the culture, he had outgrown it by the time he was interesting enough to be noticed. He did once ask an old Wynn Parish friend, excuse me, Harley Bozeman, did you notice Napoleon always had a Jew for Chamberlain? As if Bozeman would have noticed such a thing. Long probably did a little better with influential Jews in Louisiana than with influential Louisianians in general. Long was not at all impressed by Hitler. Only seemed to be 2 statements that Long made on Hitler, made at different times. The first is, don't liken me to that son of a bitch. Anybody that lets his public policies be mixed up with religious prejudice is a plain goddamned fool. And the second one, I don't know much about Hitler, except this last thing about the Jews. There has never been a country that put it heel down on the Jews that ever lived afterwards. This is a more enlightened record than many mainstream American public figures and politicians of the early 1930s. As an aside, Long's closest advisor was a guy called Seymour Weiss, who was the owner-operator of the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans. He was from an extremely humble background, Seymour Weiss, in rural Louisiana. He'd come up the hard way, and he was sensitive about it. On one occasion, he was cross-examined during Long's 1929 impeachment and he refused to incriminate Long. And during this, the reliably colorful anti-Long Mason Spencer, a planter from Northeast Louisiana, remembered, quote, Cecil Morgan and others wanted to let Seymour Weiss off the stand. I said, don't do it, keep after him. Seymour Weiss is a dude. Look at his shoes or something else. That'll fluster a dude, and it did too. Well, thankfully this is a Zoom meeting, so we can't start looking at one another's shoes to flush out the dudes amongst us. Anti-Longs in Louisiana did take part in this Long as fascist free-for-all. The state, said a speaker at a 1929 anti-Long rally in Farmerville, Louisiana, must and will be saved from the present Mussolini. J.Y. Sanders Sr., former governor, in the days following Long's death, spliced an Il Duce reference with the familiar rhetoric of white establishment violence. Why, even the black Ethiopians, armed with spears and bows and arrows, are talking of resisting another dictator across the waters, armed with the deadliest of lethal weapons. We would have been less than white men and unworthy of the fathers that sired us and the mothers that bore us, had we been willing to submit without even talk of resistance. In December 1934, the Times-Picayune could refer to Long as a senator with fascist leanings in a straight news article without missing a beat. Adolf Hitler, wrote a Baton Rouge weekly, has sent an ambassador to Baton Rouge to learn just how to run a real dictatorship. Former Kansas governor and US Senator Henry Allen wrote to John Parker, former Louisiana governor, I am disposed to laugh at him myself, but I was in Germany when they first began to laugh at Hitler, who is a sort of Teutonic Huey Long, without Huey's mercurial disposition and mental quickness. In response, Parker wrote, Lord grant that no such calamity as a Long for a Hitler will ever menace the United States. Harding Carter, about a month before Long's death, wrote that already he has shown that in one state, the American structure can be warped to a fascist dictatorship. Unlike historians of the Long period, the two most prominent anti-Longs to survive into the sort of post-T. Harry Williams era, Betty Carter and Cecil Morgan, held firm to the fascist comparison. In 1985, Betty Carter said, if you wanted free school books, great, but you didn't do it the way Huey did it. And I just keep reiterating that because that was basic. And you could say Mussolini made the trains run on time. Mussolini made the trains clean. Are you for Mussolini? So how did Huey do it? He raised taxes on oil, gas, and lumber business. It doesn't scream Mussolini-esque to me, but it did to Betty Carter. Cecil Morgan, in his furious rebuttal to Harry Williams' 1970 biography, anchored all his anti-Long arguments with the Hitler parallel, which he used as an ace card. Quote, he was a Hitler-like dictator, and he took away powers and rights of people to vest them in himself alone. Harry Williams, Morgan continued, fails to get over what probably no writer could get over to this generation unless he had lived through it, and that is the deep emotions of the day, which were fear and apprehension. The people of the state were like people who know the enemy is about to invade their land and raise their homes and loot and kill. This fear pervaded the state as a miasma. We had said it can't happen here, but it did. Morgan recalled that after Long was shot, his wife said, shut the windows, pull down the shades, there will be something like a pogrom against all the anti-Long people. This feeling of persecution was the most visceral way that the anti-Longs experienced and remembered the Huey Long period. Morgan and Betty Carter's use of the fascist label, though, was not based on a systematic analysis of data. It wasn't a scholarly definition of fascism. It was emotional, and more in line with the following definition of fascism, written by George Orwell in 1944. Orwell had observed that the word fascism had become almost completely meaningless. It was used so much. And he came up with the following as a working description of how the fascist label was used by ordinary people. By fascism, they mean, roughly speaking, something cruel, unscrupulous, arrogant, obscurantist, anti-liberal. Except for the relatively small number of fascist sympathizers, almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist. That is about as near to a definition as this much abused word has come. Well, now we have a vernacular definition of fascism that might be more useful. It's worth examining the anti-Long's experience in Orwell's terms as the bullied. Cecil Morgan described his punishment for being an opposition legislator. In the 1928 session of the legislature, he asked me to vote for a certain bill. I told Huey I could not vote for it because it was contrary to the principles of home rule and it centralized power in the executive. He left me in a huff. My father was getting very old, had been state treasurer, and now was a state bank examiner. I went home that evening and discovered that Huey had fired him. Of course, that couldn't be done because the bank commissioner was appointed for an overlapping 6-year term, but Huey did it anyway. They dangled this job over my head the rest of my term in the legislature, very adroitly having some of their men who were my friends come to me and say, Cecil, you know you could get your father's job back. Why don't you cooperate with Huey? You are ruining your career. Hodding Carter's father, Will Carter, was removed from his position on the Board of Trustees of the State College in Hammond. The position had been a reward for donating the land on which the college was built. Hilda Phelps Hammond's husband, Arthur Hammond, was fired as attorney for the New Orleans Dock Board and from his retainer position for the Levee Board in March of 1930. This was in punishment for the Times-Picayune's opposition to Long's highway bond. Hilda's brother, Esmond Phelps, was a principal of the paper and their father had been his publisher. These firings occurred shortly before Hammond set up the Women's Committee of Louisiana, whose aim was to get federal action against Huey. Long's response to Hilda Phelps Hammond was, give my hubby 2 jobs, we've got to be snobs. That was how he characterized her. The loss of income had a significant impact on these families' lives, although they managed to get by. Politics, however, to quote Robin Pantwarren in All the King's Men, is not exactly like Easter week in a nunnery, and the removal of opponents from patronage positions was an ordinary part of American political life, although Long's definition of what was a patronage position was surprisingly inclusive, especially to those who thought they were safe and discovered they were not. But to quote Plunkett of Tammany Hall, the great explainer of how machine politics works, he said, all right, Tammany is for the spoil system. And when we go in, we fire every anti-Tammany man from office that can be fired under the law. It's an elastic sort of law, and you can bet it will be stretched to the limit. Morgan, Carter, and Hammond preferred low taxation and a small bureaucracy staffed by family members rather than a larger bureaucracy staffed by their social inferiors. Well, who wouldn't? George Ginsburg, something of a one-man tempest, who broke with Long in 1929, he was a legislator, he received, from Alexandria, he received the full Long treatment. In 1932, he lost his re-election race for his state house seat to a candidate funded by as much as $25,000 from the Long campaign fund. That was a lot of money back then. The amount of money in politics today makes it all seem like nothing, but that was a lot of money. Huey really unloaded on me, said Ginsburg, still sounding shocked 20 years later. During this campaign, Long made a speech in Alexandria that Ginsburg remembered as follows. He didn't mention me except, you've got a representative up here, George Jackass Ginsburg. Next day, somebody sent me a bale of hay express. Ginsburg also remembered that he and George Peralta of St. Landry had been directors of local banks, both of which were closed down by the state's bank examiners on Long's orders. Huey ruined me, said Ginsburg, adding that Long was vindictive beyond description. Huey's estranged brother, Julius Long, wrote that I cannot win a case here before the Supreme Court and have a hard time winning one before any court, no matter the merits of the case I have. Cecil Morgan, who was a lawyer, wrote, I had trouble with my law practice because clients would frankly tell me that since I was fighting Huey, I could not get from the state what they were entitled to. So they would have to go to someone who was in with the Longs. Hilda Hammond, raising money for the Women's Committee, discovered that New Orleans businessmen would contribute, but only on condition of anonymity. Reprisals, wrote Hammond, always the fear of reprisals, assessments raised, jobs lost, punitive thrusts at relatives, personal attacks of vituperation, business interests crushed. In 101 subtle ways, blows were struck at such opponents. Harding Carter, he was the Hammond Courier that he owned and edited, resisted various carrot and stick inducements to support Long. Eventually, state and local printing contracts, essential revenues for a small local paper, were denied to the Courier. The Carters had to sell the paper in 1936 after Long's death at a decent profit to 3 Longites who rubbed salt in the wound by turning the paper into a Longite propaganda organ. Only Carter's paper lost its state printing contracts, but only he had called for shotgun government in an editorial. And in the end, of course, he got it. And after Long was shot, the pro-Longs insisted on having their revenge. Carl Weiss, Long's probable assassin, suffered what Harding Carter called the double-barreled kind of injury Long delighted in inflicting. His father-in-law, Judge Benjamin Henry Pavey, who himself knew something of the darker side of politics, was gerrymandered out of his long-held judgeship, and 2 of Weiss's female in-laws were dismissed from their teaching positions. There may also have been a third and more explosive barrel in this instance that Long spread, or was thought to be about to spread, rumors about the Pavey bloodline, inevitably of a touch of the Tarbrush variety. Carter wrote of Long's intense vindictiveness and said that the strong-arming became personal. Graham Swing wrote that the leitmotif in Huey's nature seems to be vindictiveness. Alan Sindler, another scholar, concluded that Long wasted too much of his talent punishing political foes. William Alexander Percy, a Mississippi planter who wrote a memoir of Southern life and was instrumental in bringing the Carters to Greenville, described Huey as, quote, a moral idiot of genius, but did not elaborate on either the moral idiocy or the genius. William Ivy Hare repeated the accusation. In callousness towards individuals, Huey sometimes resembled a moral idiot. George Ginsburg might have been the first to advance the idea that Long was a moral cretin in 1930, calling Long a not immoral but unmoral menace. Well, we can say with confidence then, I think, that Huey Long matriculated with full honors as a bully. He meets Orwell's standard of fascist with room to spare, even while he doesn't come close to meeting the academic standard of fascist. Some of the unpleasantness anti-Longs faced did not come from Long, but from his supporters. Harding Carter wrote, I still have the threatening, unsigned letters. Get out of town, you lying bastard, if you know what's good for you. Intermittently for 4 years, I received threats by letter and telephone and twice in person. I carried a pistol, kept in my desk during the day and by my bed at night. One anonymous letter written to Carter in the aftermath of Long's murder has survived, and it's illegible in places, but I'm going to read what I could decipher. This is the letter. I know you are the editor of the Daily Courier, and I want to compliment you on the darn lies you and your nasty reporters have been putting in your darn rotten paper. If you want to know, you brute, Huey Long was a king for us poor people. You being hasty, if you know what that means, you think you are smart guys. Huh, you dirty rats, you are worse than a skunk. How can you face people when you write about a man and he is dead? Those who are friends and know what a friend is will loathe you and your dirty newspapers, you double crossers. If Huey Long was living, you wouldn't fight him in public, you skunks. If the people knew what kind of man you are, they wouldn't look at you dogs. Even though Huey Long is dead, he will always be remembered. He will lie in history, and your children, Devil bless them with such a father as you. They will read about him in history, and you couldn't stop that. He gave us free school books and beautiful highways, and you were riding those highways to take your children to school. If I had you in my home, Mr. Carter, I don't know what would happen, so you better watch and get you some bodyguards to watch you. If the administration wins, you'll wish you were dead. He was going to make it free for poor children to go to college, but Southeastern couldn't have that because the rich people has control of that. I would never send my children there because he built that new college, he built that gymnasium, he built that new place to play football. He did all of that, but on the day of his death, they didn't close the school because such people as you had something to do with it. You darn sucker, I would like to see that ugly face of yours when you read this. And on it goes. Well, it's an unusual threatening letter because the pain the author felt comes through so powerfully and pitifully. It's mostly about education, and that the man could only just write underscored his sincerity. He is only bitter in the way a man lost in the desert is bitter when the promise of water is taken from him. It upset Carter, as it surely intended to do. He asked the post office to take action, but they demurred. And although the letter feels like a threat and one might infer a threat from it, on close reading, it really doesn't contain one except a warning to Mr. Carter not to go onto the author's property. Well, Long's favorite novel was The Count of Monte Cristo. That ought to tell us something. And in a sense, Long was the revenge fantasy of the politically marginalized. As Harding Carter wrote, the backwoods people were getting revenge, a fantastic revenge, upon the Sodom and Gomorrah that was called New Orleans, a squaring of accounts with the big shots, the Standard Oil and the bankers, the big planters, the entrenched interests everywhere. Carter here, he's hinting that the pre-Long status quo might itself have been bullying, that Long's backwoods voters might at one time have been the bullied. And this kind of checks out. For example, when blacks were disenfranchised in the Constitution of 1898, more than half of backwoods whites were also effectively disfranchised. If you look at the slide, you see the objective of the 1898 Constitution, which brought to an end the sort of upheavals that had really begun with the Civil War, almost a couple of generations of tremendous unrest in Louisiana, pretty much coming to an end in 1898 and establishing white supremacy. But you can see from the numbers, while it succeeded in its principal objective, which was to establish white supremacy and disfranchise the black vote, you can see just how much the white vote drops here. And that was mostly the backwoods voters that were disenfranchised. And really, since about 1900, the backwoods, the yeoman, the sub-yeoman voter had been practically shut out of state politics. In the form of Huey Long, this group made their return, and it was an angry, vindictive return. 20 years or so later, blacks would make their return to state politics. But it's during the Long period that you get this return of the backwoods voter, and they are pissed. One could go a little bit further than calling the predecessors of the anti-Longs bullying. One could speculate that the anti-Long establishment had some somewhat fascist characteristics themselves, not simply the Orwellian definition, but something more like the scholarly definition. The anti-Long establishment's late 19th century predecessors had strove for white unity across the economic classes. They had a deep and emotional romanticism of the South, its plantation history, its Civil War, a golden age, the antebellum golden age, a heroic, valiant defeat against an insurmountable foe, a sense of injustice about a peace settlement, what they considered the diktat of Reconstruction, external enemies, federals and carpetbaggers, internal fifth columnists, scalawags, and especially freedmen who were dehumanized using racial arguments, and in the 1890s, agrarian populists, And they had uniformed paramilitary organizations like the Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia that used extra legal violence to shape political outcomes when democratic means fell short. All of which is a reminder that the pre-Long status quo shouldn't be mistaken for the Weimar Republic or something benign and cuddly. A reminder that Huey Long was in part a reaction to what went before, and that Louisiana politics had a rough tradition. There was a lot of bullying going on. But anyway, with all due respect to the impersonal forces of history, it would be wrong, I think, to deny Huey Long his personality. That personality which the Carters, Hilda Phelps Hammond and Cecil Morgan had to endure. So I'll end with a quote from an old regular, a New Orleans machine politician, Herv Rasovich. This was speaking in 1961. I think his influence on the state, on the whole, was good, but he was a vicious, vindictive man. The crowd, the masses came to hear him call down these big people that they hated. Others had power in their organization, but he had it in himself, and he brought them all to their knees. He was utterly ruthless. It was in his rearing, his background, his feeling of being an underdog. He was uncouth. No, not deliberately so. It was the way he was. He was like a racehorse with a bad strain, and he couldn't change. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Wow, really, really interesting talk there. We have time for questions. If you have questions, if you can either put them in the chat, or if you would like to ask them, you're more than welcome to ask them. Just take your time unmuting yourself. I have a question there, Alex, I would like to ask. So in many ways, is Huey Long's rise to power also seen as a way for a breaking of Louisiana into becoming a modern state? You have to live through this period of retaliation and everything to get to the beginnings of what a state should be like in 20th century United States?
Yeah, people have made that argument that that Huey Long dragged the state out of the mud. That was the expression of the time, and that he did do it, and it came at a cost.
Right.
There's always there are pros and cons to all things. Very few things are absolutely good, but he was credited with bringing the state out of the mud. And there was a great old planter from Northeast Louisiana who was seen coming out of the state capitol, and he was a big man. He was clearly a man of great authority. He was not somebody you would expect to be for Huey Long. And he was telling his state representative, which was Mason Spencer, and if you can boss Mason Spencer around, you're a very big man indeed. And he said, now Mason, Huey Long is going to drag this state out of the mud, and I don't want you to be responsible for us not dragging the state out of the mud. So he was and he did. I mean, he did build a modern infrastructure, and he did massively modernize the state of Louisiana, but at a cost. Yeah, it's a good point.
Something looks like they unmuted themselves. If you'd like to ask that question, you're more than welcome to. No? Any other questions? All right. With that, oh, here we go.
Yes.
Here's someone. Here we go. Go ahead.
Yes. You said he did drag it out, but at what cost? And how would you summarize that cost?
The cost was a tremendous increase in the importance of patronage politics in the state. Huey Long operated a very much a Tammany Hall spoil style system. He also did. He wasn't a dictator. He didn't establish a constitutional dictatorship, but it was a de facto dictatorship by the time Huey Long died in 1934, 1935. So he had really suppressed the normal functioning of a constitutional democracy during that period, which is not something that at least I like as a centrist.
Just a follow-up.
Yeah.
A follow-up question. So given that cost, could he have achieved what he did achieve in terms of modernization of the state without incurring that cost? Could that have been politically possible?
I don't think so. But if you look at the comparison, maybe is with FDR, who did manage to do something similar nationally, and it didn't hurt as much going down. He was able to do it more with the help of establishment interests and cajole establishment interests along with him. Whereas Huey, being who he was and being from the backwoods, his instinct was just to stick the boot in, and that the establishment interests should feel uncomfortable, and that it had to be a patronage type of dictatorship in order to get the thing done. It's a very hard question to answer.
That's a very good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, that was good.
We have some more questions. Here we go. Let me see. I've got actually some interesting points here. First, Chad Pellerin says, parents of my generation, ages in their 90s before death, absolutely loved him because he built all the roads where farmers could get their goods to towns for payment. They say some of his programs place less people, I guess, in isolation. So, you see where that can work for some people. I'm aware that Theodore Weiss was a supporter of Long while Carl Weiss was the supposed assassin. Was there a relationship between the Weiss families?
No, Seymour Weiss, the operator of the Roosevelt Hotel, had no connection whatsoever with Carl Weiss, who was the probable assassin. They just have the same name. It's a coincidence.
All right. Museum employee, I mean, not museum, state employees are told that the modern civil service system is based on a response to his era in power. Can you touch on any particulars to this claim?
I can't say much about that because it's after my period, but there was civil service reform enacted after. It was actually first of all done by Cecil Morgan, who I think did it under Sam Jones's governorship, and then Earl Long got back in and destroyed it and set up a patronage regime again. And then after that, another attempt was made to bring in serious civil service reform. So that's as much as I know about the civil service.
Yeah, so it could be almost like somewhat of a response later as well as him doing it earlier, someone doing it earlier. One must recall that most of his populism was during the Depression, which hit Louisiana greatly, with townships wiped out, with jobs and commerce. Is that an accurate statement? And I guess how would you say Long fared during the Depression?
Look, it's absolutely right, and it was during the Depression, and most Orthodox people at the time who were educated thought that Huey Long was mad. But in actual fact, the way that politics have gone, Huey Long was right. I mean, the idea of borrowing during a recession in order to kickstart the economy, I mean, let's face it, that is pretty uncontroversial right now. Everybody, pretty much every country in the world is doing it. So he was almost a Keynesian before John Maynard Keynes announced his ideas. He was right, and the people like Cecil Morgan, who were appalled even at the idea of borrowing money, to spend on infrastructure, they were wrong. I mean, at least that's not the way politics has gone. I mean, the right and left today would both accept that you can borrow, to build infrastructure, and you can borrow in hard times to kickstart the economy. So his response to the Depression is pretty sound.
All right, we got questions coming in left and right now. So Charles says, I lived in Baton Rouge Garden District off the lakes while in college. Our street had Theodore Weiss's Baton Rouge house on it. The large house mounted machine guns on its roof after Huey's assassination.
Tensions were high.
Tensions were very high. Yeah. Jimmy Crocker asked, do you believe Long would have defeated Roosevelt in the 1936 election?
That's a brilliant question, and it's great fun because I can never be proved wrong for what I'm about to say. I think Roosevelt was really frightened. I think the Roosevelt supporters were frightened. They were doing everything they could to stop Long. They were working on supporting the anti-Longs in Louisiana. They were denying patronage to the state of Louisiana because Huey Long controlled it. They were conducting federal investigations into Long in terms of income taxes and other forms of corruption. And I think they were trying anything to have to avoid an all-out political street fight with Long just for voters. Because once you got Long into that kind of a contest where it was bare knuckle, they knew that Huey Long was very, very good and was able to speak to people in a way that even FDR, who was a very talented politician, couldn't do.
And do you think that the fact that he would have been, it would have been in a primary, the same party primary, would have made a difference as well?
Well, there's various ways he could have done it, and he might have run as a third-party candidate. I don't think there's any question Roosevelt would have got the Democratic Party nomination. And the question is whether Huey was trying to get FDR defeated in 1936, perhaps by supporting the Republican. So there's various ideas about how Huey was going to try and achieve this tactically, but I think it would have been. I think Roosevelt, deep in the pit of his stomach, was pretty worried about the idea of a real bare knuckle fight with Huey Long.
Charles asked, sorry. How does the deduct? Charles asks, how does the deduct box for financing Huey's operations figure into the definitions of fascism, and what happened to the deduct box?
If anybody knows where the deduct box is, can they please message me privately? And I don't know what happened to the deduct box. I tend to think of the deduct box as more of a concept rather than something that actually physically existed. This is where Long kept his contributions from state workers. They all had to they all had to pay a little fee to the machine, and Long funded his machine using these deducts. And it was all this money was supposedly in a deduct box, and apparently it went missing after Huey Long was killed. So somewhere there's a deduct box with a lot of money, and I want to find it just as much as everybody else.
Blackbeard's treasure buried somewhere.
Yes.
Chad Pellerin, who told a story earlier, said her mother said she had to contribute to the deduct box. The question is that a metaphorical idea, or
no, that actually happened. That people were deducting, they were having to make contributions. But the
Yes.
idea that all the money was held in one place, in one
Right.
sort of treasure chest, I think is where I think it's a bit more of a metaphor. But people absolutely were having to contribute a part of their salary to the Long machine. Although apparently, apart from during election times, it was only the higher ups, people who with really good plum positions in the state government, the average, the person working on the road program, doing some manual labor was not having to contribute. And by the way, I should say that really one of the main ways that Huey Long confronted the Depression was simply being able to give people some daily work on the infrastructure program so that people could have a little bit of money along with the failing farm that they were operating, or whatever else other economic activity they were involved in. They could at least get some manual work and get a few dollars, and that made a big difference, but it wasn't much.
Right, absolutely. Does anybody else have any other questions? If not, I just want to mention some upcoming lectures we have. Next Tuesday, we have Dr. William Buckingham doing Lost Songs, the Past, Present, and Future of the Louisiana Decima. Then on April 27th, we have Gottschalk and his influence in Latin American music. May 11th, the story of French New Orleans, history of a Creole city. And then June 1st, Crescent City Girls, the lives of young Black women in segregated New Orleans. So I hope that all of those different topics interest you. Alex, thank you so much. That was a great talk. And everybody will receive this tomorrow morning. I'll send it out in an email. And thank you so much for participating tonight. And thanks to you once again, Alex, for speaking. It was a very good presentation.
Thank you, Jason. It was wonderful to do it.
Glad to have you.
Thanks.